Okay, well, why don't we get started with our program? There may be a couple more people who join us as we get going, but we'll go ahead and get started. I know that a lot of people are maybe having to deal with Zoom fatigue, so we want to go ahead and get started so that the program doesn't have to extend any longer than your patience. We've been trying to keep these events at roughly about an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. So that'll be our goal for today. So let me thank everybody for joining us. Good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 33-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas. Many of the folks on the briefing today are our friends in Dallas, but we have people from all over the country with us, and we're delighted for you all to join us. I'd like to welcome you all to our briefing today on the subject of what happens when government places restrictions on free speech related to fairness and neutrality and things like that. We're going to look back today and see what happened to conservative talk radio in the 1950s and 1960s when the Kennedy administration used various kinds of regulation to essentially drive conservative talk radio out of existence. And we want to think about what that kind of fairness and neutrality regulation for old media might pose for today's new media. And just as an aside, I'm wondering how many of you even knew there was such a thing as conservative talk radio in the 1950s and 1960s. I think most of us probably think that it was invented by Rush Limbaugh and a handful of local radio talk show hosts. But in fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was such a thing as conservative talk radio that had audiences of millions of people. And we have the perfect guest today to tell us about that. Dr. Paul Matzko is a historian and author. His new book is called The Radio Right: How a Band of Broadcasters Took on the Federal Government and Built the Modern Conservative Movement. Paul, how long has that book been out?
It actually comes out on the 16th. So you're getting
so it's literally brand new.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Can that be pre-ordered at places like Amazon?
Yeah, if you go on Amazon, you can pre-order the hardcover, and actually the Kindle version's live now. So if you can't hold back after hearing this talk.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, get the e-copy.
All right, that's terrific. So he's the author of that book. He has a PhD from Penn State University, and he has an affiliation with the Cato Institute, where he hosts a podcast on emerging technology called Building Tomorrow. Now let's do the basic Zoom housekeeping. As I mentioned earlier, you can turn your video on and off. We're happy to see you, but you have control over whether or not we can see you or not. Down at the bottom menu, on the participants menu, you have the ability to raise your hand, and that's how you can signal to me that you have a question that you would like to ask when we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion. So feel free to raise your hand, and then I will unmute your microphones and call upon those questions roughly in order when we get to that part of the program. So now let's get on to our program. Paul, we're delighted to have you with us today. I have not read your book, but I'm excited to read it. When I was a child, my family was a listener to Dr. Carl McIntyre on the radio. And when I heard you make reference to shows like that, it caused sort of a flashback to childhood. So I found that to be very interesting. You know, there's a saying that goes something like this: those who do not remember history's mistakes are doomed to repeat them. And I wonder if something like that may be going on today, because the book you've written, at least in part, is a history of what happened when the government tried to regulate fairness and neutrality on conservative talk radio in the 1950s and 60s. They exterminated it. And we now have a situation where sometimes folks on the center right of the aisle are now calling for those same kinds of media and neutrality regulations for new media. And it seems that it backfired on us when we did it to old media. And I strongly suspect it will backfire on us if we do it with new media as well. So I would love to hear you talk for 20 or 30 minutes about the research in your book, the interesting things you uncovered, the big picture of how the Kennedy administration used regulation to strangle conservative talk radio, and then how you think those observations from history might apply to our current policy debate.
Happy to do so, Tom, and thanks so much for the opportunity and to the whole IPI team for putting this together. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It's funny, when I started this project back in 2010, at the time, proposals for internet regulation that looked something like the Fairness Doctrine from the 1960s, it was almost universally from the left. It was Democratic Congress people, left-wing challenges saying, hey, look, these right-wing radio broadcasters on talk radio have too much influence, therefore we should bring back the Fairness Doctrine. So it's been bizarre that now, as fast forward to when this project is being completed, right, and the book's coming out, that the primary challenges to or the primary proposals for significant internet regulation are coming from the right, from the likes of Josh Hawley, of course, Donald Trump's recent executive order. So I'm old enough to remember to watch that switch. And so it's been a funny thing to see in gestation. But I think your setup's very good, Tom, which is there is a wave of right-wing radio prior to the wave that we're all familiar with. And if you say Rush Limbaugh today, odds are almost everyone in America will recognize that name, whether they like it or not. I mean, they might not like the fella, but they're going to know who he is and recognize that his radio platform gives him political influence. And yet there was a generation of people like Rush Limbaugh 20 years before he got his start who were just as influential. In the 1950s and 60s, there are about a dozen different conservative broadcasters who air on at least 100 stations nationwide. That's up from zero earlier in the 1950s. So suddenly there's this wave of right-wing radio broadcasters reaching national audiences, and it happens essentially overnight. Carl McIntyre, who you mentioned, your family would listen to sometimes, he's the largest of these broadcasters, but he goes from being on 2 radio stations in 1957 to more than 100 by 1960 to more than 480 stations by 1964, which is actually more than Rush Limbaugh several decades later. And his audience was estimated at 20 million weekly listeners, which again is as large as Rush Limbaugh some 4 decades later, despite the national population being a good bit smaller, obviously, in 1960. So these are guys with just outsized audiences that spring up overnight. And as I said, they're conservative. So their politics run counter to the Kennedy administrations in the early 1960s. John F. Kennedy wins by a very narrow margin. And of course, the first priority of every first-term president is to become a second-term president. And Kennedy's no exception to this. He's also worried that he won by such a narrow margin that reelection is going to be another real challenge for him. And arguably, he only won because the election was stolen in Louisiana and Chicago because of Democratic machine politics. So he's paranoid. Ironically, so is Nixon because of his narrow loss in 1960, which leads to his paranoid behavior that leads to Watergate in 1968 and 1972. So this casts a long shadow, this very narrow election in 1960. And then as he's trying to govern, he keeps being attacked by right-wing radio, by this thing that didn't even exist a few years prior, right? So suddenly, every time he pushes through a policy proposal, it just gets blasted on these right-wing radio stations. And it's everything from his attempts to open trade with Eastern Europe to try to pull away Soviet-dominated countries from behind the Iron Curtain, to obviously the Bay of Pigs debacle, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think what I'll focus on here for sake of time is his attempt to secure a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. At the time, a lot of nuclear weapon testing was done above ground. It was atmospheric testing, so you could see the big impressive mushroom cloud. Of course, this is problematic because the radioactivity spreads, right? It goes through the weather patterns, and scientists and doctors were more aware of this in the 60s than they had been 10, 20 years earlier. So there was a move to push nuclear testing to only below ground testing. So Kennedy has a diplomatic outreach to the USSR in 1962, early 1963. They're putting the finishing touches on this treaty. And at first, it looks like this nuclear test ban treaty is going to sail through Congress, no problem. Supermajorities, bipartisan supermajorities in the Senate. especially post-Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy came out of that looking with a boosted public opinion rating. Whether or not that was deserved is an open question, but things looked good. And then right-wing radio, or the radio right, as I call it, they got a hold of this issue and attacked the treaty relentlessly through the spring and summer of '63. They were criticized its lack of enforcement mechanisms. Basically, all the conservative kind of neocon critiques of the Iran treaty that Barack Obama signed. Just imagine all those arguments cross-applied to the nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. And suddenly now the bill seems under threat. I mean, you need 2/3 of the Senate, and yet the multiple Southern Democrats are starting to be peeled away and signal their opposition to the bill. Constituent mail is 15-1 against the bill. So people turn off the radios and they write letters to their Congress people. So this is not great for Kennedy's reelection prospects. This was going to be his big tentpole foreign policy legislation. And he was very much a foreign policy focused president that was going to help him win a reelection. And he doesn't know he's about to get his head blown off. So he's still thinking about reelection, obviously, in '63. So what to do about this new emerging and really national threat from the radio right if you're John F. Kennedy? And the aha moment for me as a researcher, I was in the archives. I found evidence of Kennedy's involvement in what you'll see is a mass censorship campaign. But the real aha moment where it all connected back to the White House and to Kennedy himself, there was a conversation he had with one of his aides and legal advisors named Meyer Feldman on August 13th, 1963. And Kennedy tells Feldman, they're discussing the test ban treaty in opposition, and he tells Feldman, quote, "The Federal Communications Commission ought to be able to do something about Lifeline." And Lifeline is one of these big national right-wing radio programs that had been attacking the treaty routinely. And Feldman responds, well, the FCC is going into it. And then there's a garbled conversation, and Kennedy says, but of course, then the tax people. And that was the smoking gun, if you will. That was the crucial piece of evidence that showed direct White House engagement in this sweeping censorship campaign against right-wing radio. But the plan actually started earlier. It started with administration allies Walter and Victor Reuther, who were the presidents of the United Auto Workers, so they're labor union allies of the administration. And Robert Kennedy, who is JFK's brother and the Attorney General. Of course, fun fact, when people were concerned about the White House violating anti-nepotism rules, when Donald Trump put Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump in official capacities, he was violating rules that were enacted after Kennedy's appointment of his brother as Attorney General. So it's one of those funny little, resonances. But anyways, so Kennedy has his brother, RFK, Robert, meet with the Reuthers and say, look, it's the week after inauguration, but it's not too early to start planning for the congressional races in '62 and for re-election in '64. What are the threats that we need to take more seriously that we didn't take seriously enough in '60, and they're going to be an albatross in '64? The Reuthers, decide is the radio right. So in their plan, this strategy document they produced for the administration, it's known colloquially as the Reuther Memorandum. They come up with a whole list of things that the Kennedy administration should do, but the two that are most significant that are acted on, it's a kind of a pincer movement to use the IRS to stem the flow of donations to right-wing radio broadcasters, and the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission, to encourage station owners to drop right-wing radio programs altogether. So on the IRS side, there's all kinds of communication between the Attorney General's office and the IRS. In fact, the Kennedy appoints the chairman of the IRS is one of Robert's old law school professors. So there's lots of personal ties and political ties between them. And they say, look, we want targeted audits of right-wing broadcasters who mostly are tax exempt. They have some sort of educational purpose, and so they've received tax exemption in the past. We're going to audit them with an eye to removing their tax exemption.
And Paul,
yes.
If I can interrupt, is
Sure.
that because at least some of these conservative radio talk shows were actually preachers? They were tax exempt and could accept donations?
most of them went under an educational, like the equivalent of what IPI or Cato would file under today, the 501c3, but the educational exemption rather than the religious exemption. But yes, that did play a role. Actually, when Billy James Hargis is another one of these big radio broadcasters, he gets tied up in a big, almost decade-long court battle over the IRS's audit and his tax-exempt status. And the judge says, well, I would rule for Hargis, even if it was just the regular educational exemption. But since he's a minister, it's also that much stronger. He sees himself as fulfilling a religious purpose as well as an educational purpose. Sure. So that does play a role. And a lot of these guys are religious. Carl McIntyre is a Presbyterian minister. Billy James Hargis is a Christian church, Churches of Christ. Clarence Mannion is the dean of the law school at Notre Dame and a very involved Catholic layman. So religion plays a very overt role in this wave of right-wing radio, even more so than the second wave. I mean, talk radio today is not there's, wave the flag and crossing crown kind of conversation, but they're not notable for the religion in the same way that the first generation of right-wing radio hosts were. So the IRS is going after these guys with targeted audits, and it really does work. It helps dry up the supply of donations, because donors don't know if their money is going to be tax exempt or not. And so it puts a kibosh on how much people are willing to donate. And so even in failure, ultimately Hargis wins the court case after tens of thousands of dollars of court costs and legal fees. But it's a Pyrrhic victory. The IRS wins just by stemming the flow of donor uncertainty. The closest comparison would be those of you who follow current events. I'm sure you remember the IRS scandal involving the Tea Party during the Obama administration. The chairwoman Lois Lerner had slow-rolled approval for tax-exempt status for Tea Party groups. And now there's no evidence at all that the Obama administration itself was directly involved in that decision. None. It just appears to be, she had her own ideological axe to grind and went after Tea Party groups because she didn't like them. But imagine if you found smoking gun evidence of that kind of direct involvement by the Obama administration to target FCC or IRS oversight over Tea Party tax exempt approval because he was concerned about their opposition to ACA reform, to Obamacare. That would be a huge scandal, a Watergate level scandal. Again, that didn't happen. But imagine that did happen in the 1960s with JFK and the targeted use of the IRS. So that's one pincer of this censorship campaign. The other one is the FCC and the Federal Communications Commission. They're the ones who license radio stations. They assign them, you can apply for your little slice of the spectrum in your area at a particular strength for your transmitter. And every so often, you have to go to the FCC to get your license renewed if you're a station owner. And a few years prior to this, in 1959, the FCC had enacted what is known as the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine rules, along with the personal attack rules that are adjacent to the Fairness Doctrine, said that, look, we want people who own a radio station, we don't want them to over-editorialize. We don't want them to just present their own point of view because they have the power over that station license. They should represent a broader swath of views on any given issue of public importance, any current event or politician or issue of the day. And so if you air one point of view on, let's say the Vietnam War, if you air a pro-Vietnam War point of view, you should balance that out with an anti-Vietnam War point of view. That was the intent of the Fairness Doctrine. It had been honored only in the breach up until 1963, but the Ruthers, adeptly understood that this was a potential tool for extracting concessions from political opponents of the administration. And so they say, look, you need to use this to go after stations that air unbalanced right-wing points of view that criticize your administration. And Kennedy takes heed. He appoints a new chair of the FCC, E. William Henry, and he tells him right at his nomination, he says, it's very important, quote, it is important that stations be kept fair. So it's understood. The reason for his appointment to be chairman of the FCC is to enforce the Fairness Doctrine. And what Henry does and what the FCC does is they don't apply it broadly. It's only ever targeted at right-wing, at stations airing unbalanced right-wing speech. So if you were to attack the nuclear test ban treaty, you were obliged to air someone defending the nuclear test ban treaty. Furthermore, they passed something called the Coleman Doctrine during this time, which said if you aired a paid attack on the test ban treaty or on any other issue, if the other side said they couldn't pay, you had to air their response time for free. And unsurprisingly, everyone said they couldn't pay. No one could ever pay for that. So it was a bit of double jeopardy for stations. They're now on the hook. If someone airs something controversial, attacking someone in the administration or speaking into editorializing, they're now going to have to air response time for free. So it's a financially losing proposition for station owners to air that kind of controversial speech. So it has a chilling effect, and that's exactly the point. In fact, the Kennedy administration creates a front organization called the Citizens Committee for Nuclear Test Ban. They actually created it in the Oval Office in the meeting with the Ruthers. They laundered cash from the Ruther brothers. So because if the administration threatens Fairness Doctrine enforcement against their own critics, that looks bad, right? Because it is bad. So they don't want to do that. So if you create the front organization that has tax exempt status itself, ironically, it doesn't look like the administration is doing it itself. It looks like a bipartisan, nonpartisan kind of affair. So it's a way of laundering administration tactics. And that's actually where the Coleman Doctrine comes from. It comes from a Citizens Committee test ban Fairness Doctrine complaint against the set of stations in Coleman, Alabama. So it all kind of comes full circle. The nuclear test ban treaty, it passes. It does pass through the Senate, but not without a battle, and that had been unexpected. Kennedy's then, we've been talking August, September 63. He's, of course, dead by the end of the year because of the assassination. But that next year, the Democratic National Committee say, hey, look, this is a great tool for suppressing the political opposition. So the DNC picks up that banner and runs with it. They have a project to help congressional Democratic candidates in 64, help get favorable airtime for Lyndon Johnson's campaign that year as well. And in their actually after action report, and again, I go into a great deal more detail about this in the book, but in their after action report back to the chairman of the DNC, John Bailey, they actually tell him that their lead operative says, quote, more important than the free radio time, and they had gotten hundreds of hours of free reply time for pro-administration allies in the final weeks leading up to November 64. But more important than the free radio time was the effectiveness of this operation in inhibiting the political activity of these right-wing broadcasts. So what you have there is the chilling effect was not an unintended consequence of an overzealous enforcement of the Fairness Doctrine. The chilling effect was the point. The point was to discourage station owners from airing right-wing broadcasts in the first place. Now, again, for sake of time, I won't go on into this. The rest of the book deals with basically after the DNC drops their participation in 65, the U.S. Senate Democrats and the Commerce Committee and the National Council of Churches, they both use the Fairness Doctrine to accomplish their own goals in 66 and 67. But the net effect of all this censorship campaign from roughly 62 to 67, is that right-wing radio broadcasters in just a few years lose between a third to more than a half of the stations that broadcast them. By the end of the 70s, most of them are down to 10 to 20% of their previous reach, their previous number of stations that willing to air them. And it really, the radio right doesn't recover until the end of the Fairness Doctrine. First, the Carter administration relaxes enforcement of the Fairness Doctrine, and then the Reagan administration in 87 ends the Fairness Doctrine more formally. And that's what clears the way for a resurgence of right-wing radio and the talk radio that we're familiar with. And I think in terms of its significance for today that you asked about, Tom, there is a cautionary tale here, right? There are folks even now from both political parties trying to enact and cross-apply the Fairness Doctrine to the internet. And some of them are very overt about this. There's they've actually said we should apply public interest regulation, which is from the broadcasting world, to the internet. And it's just very, very historically uninformed and I think politically naive. So Josh Hawley, a Republican senator from Missouri, last summer proposed a bill that would have empowered a panel at the Federal Trade Commission, at the FTC, that would certify social media platforms on the basis of political non-discrimination. And it's kind of a positive versus a negative valence, and we can get into that later if you want. But it is similar in that it has, the attempt to ensure non-discrimination or neutrality is not unlike the attempt to ensure fairness on radio in the 60s. And it's similar in that it runs into the same flaws. You have an unelected board of lawyers and political functionaries over which the executive would have significant informal influence. That leads to a high risk of regulatory capture by industry interests, the ability to pressure networks to chill speech from folks that the administration doesn't approve of, or to reward speech by those that the administration does approve of. It's also bizarre given that the outcomes for conservatives in particular. So the left-wing one makes sense because, well, you can get why you'd be angry at the success of talk radio and its influence in conservative politics. So I would disagree with it, but it makes a certain kind of logical sense in a crass political way. But the right-wing one makes zero sense at all, because the last time we saw these rules abused and wielded to partisan purpose, it was to punish conservative speech, not to reward it. So it makes very little sense at all. And in fact, there's an A/B test for those of you who like that kind of thing. There's an A/B test here, which is what does a media form look like with tight government oversight over content moderation and over tight regulatory oversight? Have we seen this happen before? Can we test what that looks like? And the natural test is the difference between two forms of television broadcasting. Network television broadcasting, which was tightly regulated by the FCC. It's why you can't say certain words on primetime television or show nudity or too much violence and the like, versus cable broadcasting, which comes later in the late 70s and 80s, which is essentially by congressional order not regulated by the FCC for content. And which of those two, network television versus cable television, which of those two has made room for conservative voices more than the other? Well, obviously it's cable television. So you don't even have to look all the way back to the 60s in radio to see why encouraging government oversight over content moderation and just content in general is a particularly bad idea for conservative voices. And then I think the last thing I'll mention here, we should oppose this. Both Democrats, Republicans, liberals, progressives, libertarians, conservatives should oppose this on principled grounds as a violation of free speech guarantees in the U.S. Constitution. But also we should do it for our own sake. I'm reminded here of Sir Thomas More's words from A Man for All Seasons, that we should give, quote, even the devil the benefit of the law for our own safety's sake. And I'm pretty sure that Donald Trump thinks Jack Dorsey from Twitter is the devil, but even Jack Dorsey and Twitter deserve the benefit of the law too, if for no other reason than for all of our own safety's sake.
Paul, I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you a few questions, but I want to give our audience an opportunity. This would be the time, if you have a question or comment that you would like to make, if you want to maybe in a civil way contest anything that that Paul or I may have said, this is your time to raise your hand. Go down to the participants menu, click on the raise your hand option, and you can get in a queue for asking questions. And I'm trying to look right now. We have at least one now, but I'm going to engage Paul with a couple of questions of my own, just since I have this incredible power of control over the Zoom event. And then we'll open the floor up for questions. So Paul, back to the history, I'm just kind of curious, how did eliminating the Fairness Doctrine become a priority of the Reagan administration? I remember it happening, and sadly, I'm old enough to remember before we got rid of the Fairness Doctrine, and how every once in a while, maybe on a Friday night on the evening news, they would set aside 5 minutes for some crank from the local town to come on and present his alternate view. Sometimes they were informed and sometimes they were ridiculous. And and sometimes they formed the basis for skits on things like Saturday Night Live and things like that, because there was a requirement that in order to hold their broadcast licenses, they had to allow for time for alternate views.
Yeah.
So that was sometimes interesting and sometimes comedic. But how did it become? I mean, this actually turns out to be one of the tremendous accomplishments of the Reagan administration, that they got rid of it. And so I'm interested, just briefly, in the sort of history. How did that become a priority for them?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's both the Reagan administration and Carter. So Carter's FCC, and we tend to give Reagan credit for being the great deregulator because of his battle with airline
pilots
union right. and the like. But it's actually Carter who does as much, if not more, deregulatory action as Reagan. I mean, he deregulates the beer industry, and it's actually air travel pricing gets deregulated under the Carter administration, setting up the battle that Reagan has with the unions a few years later. But also the FCC, and I think for Carter it was he just was regulation averse. I mean, he's a Southern Democrat, relatively conservative by the standards of the time. And he put in people at the FCC who shared his suspicion of Washington bureaucrats using deciding what is fair and what isn't in broadcasting. So it starts with Carter, but then for Reagan, it's very personal. Now, actually, in the final chapter of my book, I have a whole big long section about Radio Ronald Reagan. Reagan, of course, he starts his career in radio. He does sports announcing. Famously announces a game, not watching the game. He was just making it up as he went because the play-by-play went out for him, and so he just started describing stuff he wasn't observing. And anyways, he was an adept communicator, and he started on the radio before he went out to Hollywood and before the movies and the like. And it's very notable that Reagan himself, after he lost, he put his name in the hat in 1972. He started looking. He was interested in getting the Republican nomination in 1972, but he has to bow out pretty early. And 1976, then he runs right and loses, but he goes surprisingly deep against Ford, and in 1980 he wins. But in the interim, he had to make a decision. After 1976, they come to him and they say, "Look, we'll offer you. We all get you're the heir apparent. Like if Ford doesn't win against Carter, you're going to be the front runner in 1980. So let's give you your pick of what you want to do in the interim. You're no longer the governor of California. So what are you going to do with your time?" They offered him an ambassadorship to the United Kingdom. They offered him the chairmanship of the Republican National Committee. They offered him CBS came to him and said, "We'll give you a primetime news slot once a week to, be basically do an op-ed for CBS during primetime news," which is a real plum. But he says no to all of that. And instead he does a radio show. He writes all of his own bits for a regular radio show. And he figures that there's this mass audience, underappreciated audience of grassroots conservative activists who are listening to right-wing radio, even in the 70s. And they are interested in someone who will present a conservative point of view. And so he jumps at the opportunity. And he does radio broadcasts. So folks in the 70s, often, if you were a hardcore Reaganite before it became cool to be so in the 80s, a lot of folks became conservative or became engaged in the conservative movement because they listened to Reagan on the radio in the 70s. And he chose that. He saw that as the key to his success. And he was also very aware of the Fairness Doctrine because of that experience in the 70s, that there were stations that wouldn't air him because it was, considered a little too controversial, too overtly political. Other stations, they had the balance. He was the balancing act for other folks, but he was only given driblets of time. And so he was very much aware as a radio broadcaster himself of the restrictions of the Fairness Doctrine. So that's why I think in 1987, he is very much a stalwart defender of getting rid of it, despite congressional pushback.
That's really interesting. Just as an aside, that is literally my personal story of how I became a conservative, was sitting around the breakfast table listening to Ronald Reagan on the radio.
Yeah.
And, just as a teenager, it dawned on me that there was somebody who had rational explanations to me for all the stuff I saw going around, and everything that he said made sense. And so, I mean, I became a committed conservative listening to Ronald Reagan on the radio, and I know that an entire generation of people had something like that same experience.
Yeah.
So, hey, let me jump forward to sort of the current debates. You know, I think we already have an example of the chilling effects of not just regulations, but sort of the threat of regulations. You know, conservatives spent several years bashing Twitter for what they interpreted as Twitter's bias against them. And you know, Twitter probably does have a bias against conservatives to some degree, just because they're a Silicon Valley company. But so then Twitter announces that they're going to refuse to carry any kind of political advertising, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, conservatives start criticizing Twitter for not accepting political advertising. Well, what did you expect them to do? Because if they're going to carry political advertising, then they're going to have to make decisions about which ones to carry and which ones not to carry, which ones are misleading, which ones are dishonest, da 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 da. And so what do they decide to do? They just decide to wash their hands of the whole thing and just absolve themselves of carrying political advertising. And it seems to me that was a rational reaction on their part, even though I disagreed with it, but it's a rational reaction on their part to all of the criticism and all the threats of regulation and things like that.
Well, it's a great example. I mean, we use the term jawboning to describe the informal lobbying. You're working the refs. So you don't always have to have like formal fairness doctrine regulation to extract what you want from private actors. Sometimes merely the threat of regulation is enough to compel them to change their behavior, or the threat of a boycott, the threat of some kind of action. And so both sides, but I think conservatives right now, I mean, the Trump's executive order is an example of jawboning. Both sides have been trying to work the refs to extract concessions from the major social media platforms in ways that help speech of their allies and hurt speech of their opponents. It's somewhat similar to the Nixon administration. So Nixon never actually used the Fairness Doctrine in the same way that Kennedy had. But what Nixon did do very effectively was he used the threat of the Fairness Doctrine to jawbone network television heads into giving him more favorable coverage. So like very early on, he sent H.R. Haldeman, Chuck Colson, all of his operatives to meetings with NBC, CBS executives who, and they just would let drop like, look, we want better coverage of Nixon's conduct of the Vietnam War. And if you don't provide that, then we might have to escalate this by reinforcing the Fairness Doctrine and forcing you to give us more favorable, let us respond to your attacks on our administration. And they all backed down. And it's notable that the people who stood up to Nixon were not the television networks. It was not network television. It was print media, which print has long had much more robust First Amendment speech protections than has broadcasting, in part because of all this public interest legacy. And it is print that the Nixon administration could not lean on as effectively, could not jawbone as effectively as they could broadcast, which had much weaker constitutional protections.
I'm going to bounce one more thing off of you, and then we're going to go to the folks in our audience who have asked questions. So again, if you would like to ask a question, go down to the participants menu, click on the raise your hand option, and you'll be in the queue with a couple of other folks who are already there, and we will give you an opportunity to ask your question. Paul, as a center-right person who is somewhere on the spectrum between libertarian and conservative, I just sort of have a bias that any power that government has is going to be used against us more often than it's going to be used against the left, just because the left is the party of government. On the center right in general, we think we have better things to do than be involved in government. And on the right, it seems like that's almost like a religious institution for them. They seem to be more skilled at using the institutions of government. And I just wonder if you share my concern and share my bias that if the center right, if Republicans create some sort of a neutrality or fairness canon that the federal government can point at people, that it will more often than not be pointed at us rather than being pointed at the left.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what I'll say is that I call it the shoe on the other foot test, that when you're proposing, and it doesn't matter who it is, Republican, Democrat, left, right, when you're proposing a new agency or a new set of regulations, always ask yourself first, rather than only thinking about the good it will do for me and mine, how could this be used by the other side to do harm to the body politic and to me and mine? And if you just do that simple kind of self-test, you'll avoid a lot of trouble. And but most people don't do that until after it's too late. So in fact, some of the people in my book, the Democratic operatives who ran the DNC's campaign in the summer of '64, they all have a kind of come to Jesus moment when information comes about Nixon's use of the threat of Fairness Doctrine complaints to go after, critics of his administration. And after Watergate, they actually talk. I mean, some of this documentary evidence exists because they all said, oh, that's right. If we get to do it when it's our turn, they get to do it when it's their turn. Whoops, right? So there's this that comes too late, though. Usually it's very hard to repeal these things. It's kind of remarkable that we repealed the Fairness Doctrine because it was a very useful bipartisan tool for suppressing the other side. There's all kinds of other examples. The one that pops in the mind is the origins of the House Un-American Activities Committee, right? It's infamously used during the McCarthy era to go after suspected communists. Whether or not they're actually communists is, of course, open to interpretation, but it was used to go after the radical left in the 1950s. But its origins in the late 30s and 40s, in the Dies Committee and others, its origins were as a tool against the right. It was against the kind of fascistic right, the silver shirts and whatnot of the 30s and 40s. And they also swept up some more mainstream conservative groups, got caught up in that as well in the 30s and 40s. So it was, no one on the left, no one in the Popular Front movement in the 1930s or in the Roosevelt administration, they just thought, oh, this is a great way of suppressing radical right-wing speech. Little did they know 20 years later, the cannon would be swung around to bear on them and theirs. So that's always true. So I agree, that's a great test to ask. How will this feel when it is inevitably used against people who I like?
Yeah, a great example of that, frankly, is the reason that the Trump administration has been so successful in getting judges appointed is that when the Democrats had control of the Senate, they weakened the filibuster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so, we said at the time, we are going to use this against you if you do this. And sure enough, the Trump administration has had a unprecedented level of success getting their judges through because of the fact that the Senate created a device to do so. So,
very true.
Okay, so we're going to go to Sam Ratcliffe for our first question. And then our second question is going to come from Mark Henley. The reason I mentioned that is Mark, according to my Zoom panel, Zoom does not show you having an audio device, a microphone of any kind. So after Sam asks his question, I'll call on you, but we may not be able to hear from you. I'm not sure. So maybe you could look into that in the meantime. Sam Ratcliffe, go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I just want to say, by way of background, I can credit or maybe blame my mother for my early interest in politics in grade school, because in the kitchen, when she'd be making supper, I'd be in there after school, I would hear Carl McIntyre, Dan Smoot, Fulton Lewis, those kind of guys, And of course, I guess, H.L. Hunt here in Dallas, Lifeline was his deal.
Yeah. So
one question I have about this alternative views that I never understood. Who determined what was an alternative view? For example, the Vietnam War. I like either the Eugene McCarthy approach of don't do anything or the Barry Goldwater approach of go ahead and win. But it became, there's the Lyndon Johnson approach or the Viet Cong or Wonderful approach. But what's the alternative? Was there a third way? Then this has become impossible to police what is an alternative view. And do you see that happening if things keep going with internet regulation and things like that?
That's a great question, Sam. Yeah, and every time I talk about the book, someone will say, I remember that as a kid, sitting in the kitchen, my grandparents, my mom would have this on the radio all the time. In fact, Sam, you'd really love, since you have a connection to your mother, the second chapter of the book is all about the Polish ham boycott of '62, where all these suburban housewives take up arms and basically defeat Kennedy's trade policy. I actually favor Kennedy's trade policy, but it's this wonderful tale of women, of conservative women in an act of housewife populism, rattling the halls of power. So in honor of your mother,
Okay.
That's a chapter to
I
check
can't
out.
remember if we quit buying Polish hams or not. We would have ham occasionally. I don't know if they were Polish or not. So
Yeah.
anyway,
You'll have to ask her. So well, anyways, but so I would say yes. I mean that there was how to put this. So it's repeat that second the part of the question there.
Well, who determines what's an alternative view? I mean, they're not always polar. There can be shadings, and we want to stop the communists in Southeast Asia, but the Johnson McNamara stupidity is ridiculous.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So you're absolutely right that it was always chaos and confusion. There was no clarity over what was sufficient to be fair, because most issues don't have two sides. There's gradations of there's different ways of approaching a singular topic. Not everything is A, B, yes, no. It's all qualified and nuanced. And so it was a very crude, the Fairness Doctrine was a crude tool there was always a confusion, lack of clarification over what that meant. In general, what ended up happening, though, was that it meant the point of view that kind of like median Republican and the point of view that the median Democrat would favor on any given issue. Mm-hmm. And the problem with this is that if your view didn't fall, I mean, if you weren't the median Republican or median Democrat, if you were more radical, either left or right, or you just didn't fall into those buckets, the odds of getting airtime were essentially zilch. So yeah, either it was Speaker A, Major Edgar Bundy might attack Johnson's behavior after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and allege that he was using that as a pretext to put more boots on the ground in Vietnam, which he was. We know that now. But the Johnson administration would say, well, we think that's not what's going on, so we want free response time, saying that we're doing it to defend America and yada yada. But like, there's no gradation in between that. It's either anti or for. And so I think you see the same thing today, that a Fairness Doctrine type system. So if we put into place what Josh Hawley proposed for the internet, we invested this panel at the FTC. Well, the panel at the FTC would have 3 members of one political party and 2 members of the other political party, like the FCC is set up. And they're all going to be either Democrats or Republicans, because that's the president appoints them. So if your point of view is not a dyed-in-the-wool Republican or Democratic point of view, you're not going to get the defense of this neutrality commission. They're not going to. Who's going to stand up for your rights? So it tends to, in the face of this ambiguity, protection goes to whoever has the most pre-existing political power and influence. It benefits the incumbents. And in our political system, the incumbents are Republicans and Democrats. And if you're kind of an outsider or on the periphery of the political situation, tough luck. And yeah, we should expect that to happen with internet, just like it did with radio.
Okay, let's try to take a question from Mark Henley. Mark, as I indicated to you, my panel makes it look like you're not going to be able to ask a question, but please go ahead and give it a try. And it looks like my panel is correct. Mark, you show up as not having a microphone. So I apologize. I'm not sure what the problem is there. We have a question from, let's see. We have a question from Joe Barnett, but I'm having, Joe, give me a minute to unmute you. Let's see. While I'm trying to unmute Joe, Paul, I'm going to ask you another question. I was listening on the way into this is what a nerd I am. I was listening on the way into the office today to Milton Friedman's famous speech about the role of government in a free society. And he's talking about the fact that everyone focuses on market failures, but then no one ever takes into account government failures. And government fails actually more often than markets fail. And so he was addressing this very idea that when you try to solve a perceived problem in the market with government regulation, you almost always make things worse. because of government failure too. And I thought that was directly applicable to what we were going to be talking about today, because we have folks who are saying, there's a kind of a market failure. These major social media platforms are not, in their perception, are not being fair, are discriminating against one set of views or another set of views or whatever. But not taking into account that the status quo might be better than the result of government action or government regulation. And that very often in an imperfect world filled with imperfect people, we end up with imperfect results, but they may still be better results than what government would give us. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree. And we also we're not a very patient people. I mean, by it's human nature, I suppose. And our tolerance of the amount of time we're willing to give it before we declare something a market failure is often just too short. It's like something is wrong. It must be a market failure. So we need the government to come in and fix it. Whereas if you just waited, especially in the tech sector, this is very apparent. So those of you who remember observed the tech sector in the 90s, everyone assumed that Microsoft was going to be this utterly dominant force. It was buying up all these smaller companies. It was going to be the big tech company that would breach no challengers. Internet Explorer was going to be the browser that everyone was forced to use by default. So there was a whole antitrust case against Microsoft that forced them to unbundle to allow other browser software to be used, et cetera. But by the time the antitrust case was actually finally settled in court, Microsoft didn't look so above challenge any longer. And it feels kind of quaint now to think about Microsoft as an insuperable big tech platform, because it's now it's not. Now it is not that kind of dominant position. It's Amazon Web Services provides the kind of server function. There's lots of other browser. It just feels antiquated now to complain about. The same thing was true of MySpace. People used to assume in the social media world that you can find articles from the early 2000s where people said, well, we need to go in there.
I have a file folder full of them.
Yeah.
This is just for my own amusement. I have a file folder full of articles calling for antitrust breakup of MySpace.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, the market solved that problem.
And the same thing's true now. So Facebook, they actually are in trouble. It might not look like on the surface because their user base is still large, but when it comes to new media forms, they're in trouble. Their attempt to compete with TikTok for young users. I mean, because like from Facebook's perspective, no one involved in this Zoom chat matters. We're all too old, right? You want the next generation. You want 18 to 24-year-olds or 29-year-olds. And so, we're all superlative, but Facebook is in real trouble because they call it Lasso. That was their attempt to compete with TikTok, just been blown out of the water. So the next social media forms, they're in real trouble on, and they know it. They know it. So even Facebook, as dominant as it looks, is in deep water going forward. They're in more trouble than people realize. Or even in this case, we're using Zoom, and Zoom is still probably the single largest teleconferencing platform, but there's all kinds of new alternatives that have popped up in the teleconferencing space that are competing very effectively with Zoom. And we wouldn't have realized that wouldn't have been so apparent 3 months ago. And this has shown that Zoom, even though it's again, so things that appear to be insuperable monopolies that are market failures that need government policing, just give it a little time, exercise a little patience.
Yeah, this is one of my sort of hobby horses in policy is, as defenders of the market, I'm not obligated to defend the results that the market is delivering at any given slice in time. I mean, these things tend to solve themselves over time. It reminds me of the major antitrust case against IBM, right? Which, by the time the verdict was rendered, it was irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because IBM was no longer the dominant, technology manufacturer. So Mark Henley has shared his question in the chat, which was brilliant. Thank you, Mark. So Mark's question is, he heard Rush Limbaugh mention something about localization rules with the FCC, and that apparently Rush has expressed the concern that there's already regulations in place that could be used to choke out conservative talk radio on the basis of this localization regime. And so he's asking you for your thoughts on that and if you're familiar with that.
I might have to pitch this. I know you guys at IPI are doing you're doing a follow-up on like Section 230 regulation, whatnot. I mean, so they're going to have some real legal scholars who I think will be more up to date on localization. I will say that one of the things that you realize as you spend time looking at taking a fine look at broadcasting in the 60s or today, looking at media regulation, you should be concerned by the fact that a lot of policies with far-reaching effects are being made by a handful of unelected bureaucrats in small rooms, right? Like the Fairness Doctrine was validated by Congress, but they didn't really know what they were validating in 1959. They just thought it meant that both candidates from both political parties would get equal airtime during debates. They wanted to make sure that debates were televised, and they wanted to make sure that if one campaign bought ad time, the other campaign could buy equal ad time. They didn't really realize what they were getting with all this Fairness Doctrine, equal time stuff. That was a handful of FCC lawyers in a room and FCC commissioners who thought that was a good idea, and they passed the rules and then managed to kind of sneak it in to get congressional approval in 59. You don't even always need, I mean, with the rise of the administrative state, you don't even need congressional bright line approval anymore.
Right.
So you should be right to be worried about localization as kind of a Trojan horse for speech control. But I'll cede to your panel in a week or two, Tom.
Yeah, what Paul's referring to is we are putting together a program, another Zoom briefing, where we will drill down on the details of social media regulation, fairness regulation, Section 230, that sort of thing. We haven't announced that yet, but we are putting that together right now. So if you're really interested or really concerned about these areas, we'll be doing something that is very specifically applied to them. And now we have a question from Joe Barnett. Joe, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Paul, you may have touched on this, but I'm wondering about the application of this of the Fairness Doctrine to cable television. Conservatives seem, right wing, is it right wing radio or conservative talk radio?
Yeah.
Has been really successful. Left wing, not so successful. Unless you looked at maybe, FM music-oriented stations and ethnic stations which carry Black programming, which is some of that opinion programming, which is really, I guess it's a niche, but it's also very opinionated in a particular direction that's anti-conservative, that's for sure. So, but on cable, we have choices, and presumably if the Fairness Doctrine applied to that, Fox and MSNBC would go away. But surely, that doctrine would apply to them today. That's my question. And then second question, if I could get one in, is why do we see in the name, not so much of fairness, but of, I guess, social, political correctness, we see newsrooms of print media, rising in revolt and demanding retractions, as at the New York Times, of the Tom Cotton op-ed, and people are getting fired for it. And we see similar cancel culture at some of these tech firms, but we don't see any calls for eliminating, Fox News or MSNBC from cable. So, and we don't see the employees of Spectrum, whatever that is, that conglomerate or similar conglomerates, Charter, et cetera, rising up and demanding, that this content be eliminated. I wondered your thoughts on those two things.
Yeah, two good questions. I mean, to the first, cable broadcasting was always exempted in its modern form. I mean, the actual technology is very old. Running a cable into mountain valleys goes back to the 1950s. or even the late 40s. But the technology's old. But in terms of how we think of cable as this mass national network of largely unregulated cable broadcasting, that was never under the Fairness Doctrine. So that's not brought about till the late 70s and into the 80s. So it was a conscious decision by Congress to not apply public interest regulation that had applied to the radio networks and to television networks to cable broadcasting. So, and that's why you get such a diversity of viewpoints on cable TV that you don't get on network TV. I mean, everything from I don't know, John Oliver and the Daily Show to Fox News network programming, right? Like the point of views that are allowed is much broader and more diverse on cable TV. I think precisely because there was no Fairness Doctrine from the birth, and also created a culture of openness to some extent. As far as the New York Times, why there's a brouhaha there as opposed to Fox News or some other media outlet. Part of that's because it's just the particularities of the New York Times, which attempts, whether it succeeds or not, but it attempts to be the paper of record, the gray lady. It tries to, it really does. I mean, the newsroom is going to have a certain, most journalists are Democratic voters. They tend to skew a little bit towards the left in their politics. But the New York Times does try to be the paper of record and represent a broad point of views, especially through their op-eds. And so when you try to do that, when you don't try to kind of seek your editorializing niche, you're more likely to have blow-ups like they're having over the Tom Cotton op-ed. Whereas Fox News has a much narrower, or MSNBC or whoever, this is ideologically agnostic, but all these outfits have a much more narrow editorializing range that they engage in. So you're less likely, you're not going to get the conservative listeners to MSNBC writing in to cancel their cable subscription, or the liberal listeners of Fox News. You get the idea, right? They have a much narrower, more homogenous range of audience. Whereas the New York Times, in trying to be the paper of record, is more likely to alienate someone or another with any given op-ed.
Okay, we have a question from EB. EB, go ahead, please.
Hi, so I was just wondering what the effect of the Fairness Doctrine was on political polarization. So you said how it's sort of like moderate Republican versus moderate Democrat. And I'm wondering if, like, say it was introduced again, would our political discourse become more extreme? Like, I think we've all seen the panels on cable news of people shouting over each other. Or would it be less extreme and sort of move more to the center, as some people believe it has in the past?
That's a great question. I would say, yes, it would have a de-radicalizing, depolarizing effect. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, well, that's not that's not really my historical, it's not a historical question, right? And I would say it's bigger than the Fairness Doctrine, that this whole set of public interest regulations that predate the Fairness Doctrine, that applied to radio from the 1927 on, in general had a consensus creating effect. It tended to squeeze out radical left and radical right-wing voices. So in the 1930s, that meant squeezing out open socialists. There was essentially socialist organizations and labor unions that tried to buy radio stations in the 30s would get their applications denied because they fell outside of the kind of consensus politics of the time. Same thing applied to right-wing voices. I've written about some of them before in other pieces, Fighting Bob Schuler in Los Angeles and others. So anti-New Deal critics were also being squeezed out. So the net effect of all of these kind of content and speech regulations on media forms, from radio to television to the internet, is to create a kind of narrower vision of the political consensus and squeeze out radical voices. The thing to remember, though, also, this is kind of the shoe on the other foot test, and that might sound okay. I mean, if I were, the kind of right in the heart of what it means to be a Democrat or Republican today, that might sound all right. Hey, so what? We squeeze out some of those crazies on either side. That doesn't sound so bad. But the problem is, all of our movements started on the political margins. I mean, we weren't. If you happen to be a conservative, modern conservatism started off as radical, crazy political periphery in the 1930s and 40s. It was in the political wasteland and moved into the mainstream, in part because of the radio right, because it was effectively, there was no Fairness Doctrine in the 50s and into the 60s. The same thing is true. So just because you're in the center of the kind of political mainstream now, you once weren't, and you might not be again. And I think for a vibrant civic sphere, for a vibrant democracy, you need to have the ability for marginalized peripheral movements to be heard and to potentially move into coalition or be subsumed by the mainstream political movements. And if you don't do that, it kind of builds pressure. That it contributes to a situation where people don't feel like they have a voice and they give up on democracy altogether. So yes, I mean, the answer to your question, the Fairness Doctrine and public interest regulation in general tends to have a consensus building effect, but that might not be a great thing.
Okay, I'm going to give Sam Ratcliffe the luxury of a second question, and then Sam's will be the last question. And then after that, Paul, I'm going to ask you to sort of sum up and make your recommendations to the folks on the center right who are calling for regulation. But let me ask Sam to ask his question first. Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, Tom, thanks a lot, and thanks for the luxury of a second question. I love the behind-the-scenes discussion of the Kennedy administration and just that it was not all wonderful Camelot. Do you think things like your book will do anything to sort of take the bloom off that rose, or do you think that legend is so impervious now that it will? I mean, you hear many conservatives saying, "Well, can he be a conservative today if you're a president?" I mean, the whole Camelot mystique. There was the great First Family parody album by Von Metter, but pulled after the assassination. But that's an unanswerable question. Maybe just what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so this gets down the historiographical weeds a little bit, but in terms of how historians tend to assess the Kennedy administration, and I'm not sure anything that we do can change the popular perception of the Kennedys, because I mean that the Camelot image has such a long half-life. But among scholars of the Kennedy administration, we've moved through phases. And the initial phase was kind of hagiographical. It was very much, venerated the Kennedys, and mostly because it was written by former Kennedy administration officials like Ted Sorensen and others who had nothing but good to say about their boss, unsurprisingly. And being assassinated was the best thing that could have happened for Kennedy's legacy. I mean, it turns him into a kind of a martyr, and all the bad stuff he might have done gets, so for example, because he was assassinated, folks are able to remember Kennedy as either, that people will do this at the same time. Some folks will say if Kennedy had lived, he would have prevented the Vietnam War because deep down inside he was secretly anti-Vietnam, and it was the generals that killed him because he was going to end the war. Or people will say if he had been left in place, he would have won the war quicker than, it wouldn't have lingered. He was actually like getting ready to send in the troops and aggressively prosecute it, and he was killed. So there's this bizarre. Anyone can. It's a Rorschach test. What you think of Kennedy, you can, because he was killed early. But among historians, so that initial wave of hagiographical works, then as Kennedy gets seen back through the lens of Watergate, through the lens of Nixon, people start to say, "Oh, man, he really abused his power a lot." I mean, there was he worked glove in hand with Hoover at the FBI to intimidate everybody from organized crime bosses to civil rights activists. He was warrantlessly wiretapping everyone under the sun. I mean, he leaned on the steel industry executives. He had the FBI call in like heads of steel industry companies at like in the middle of the night to interview them about price fixing and gouging and stuff, doing all kinds of abusive executive power. So seen through Kennedy, through Nixon, that looked really bad. Then there was a new school of thought later on that said, you know what? He actually wasn't so bad. Maybe he really had a lot of promise as a president, and we should judge him not for the little he was able to get done, but also judge for what he was trying to do with like civil rights and the like. So people have had a rosier image among scholars of the last couple of decades. I put myself in the neo-revisionist school, which is to say, and in part, I mean, this is somewhat telling, we should see a resurgence of neo-revisionism, this like critical reevaluation of Kennedy, because just as they were looking at him through the image of Nixon, someone who was very willing to abuse executive power, we are now looking through Kennedy through the prism of Donald Trump. And of course, abuses of executive power are very much on people's minds right now as well. So it's kind of this constant tick-tock back and forth how people think about Kennedy in the scholarly community. But I don't think anything's going to penetrate the Camelot mythology that Jackie and some former administration officials created in the years right after the assassination.
All right. Well, Paul, why don't we wrap up by, I want to bring us back to the present day. And based on all of your knowledge and history, the effects of all of these regulations, what is your comment and what is your suggestion for folks on the center right, again, who are concerned about the neutrality of some of these new media and social media platforms and who are calling for regulation? What's your general take on that and your recommendation for policymakers?
I would say, be careful you don't get what you wish for. I mean, and one of the things that is really should be a red flag, just a klaxon siren going off, when it comes specifically to Section 230 attempts to weaken Section 230 protections for the internet, protections from liability for user posted content on platforms. The thing that really should just wave the red flag for you is that both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, both liberals and conservatives, have contrary proposals to weaken Section 230 that they just confidently assume will lead to completely opposite ends. So there have been left-wing proposals to weaken Section 230 in order so that they can limit hate speech, that social media platforms that post, Nazi content and the like, or hateful racist speech can be liable for hate speech that users post on their platforms. And they are confident that because of this, it will clean up the Internet's Act and, platforms will get rid of all this hateful content. At the same time, on the right, there's a confidence that if we weaken Section 230, we'll be able to get a more robust hearing of conservative voices. They won't be algorithmically punished in Google search results. They won't be shadow banned on Twitter and the like. These two things are in complete consonance, right? Or in complete dissonance, I should say. They are either one or the other will happen. So when two people both very confidently propose that weakening this set of rules is going to lead to complete opposite ends, that should be a warning flag that you might not get what you intend by going after 230. So that's, I think, the first note I would make is that before you undermine the 26 words, as John Kossoff has put it, 26 words that created the internet, before you undermine Section 230, on the back of which that those First Amendment protections are how we end up with American dominance in social media and in so much software used around the globe today, be sure that you're not going to destroy, you're going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs in economic terms. Be sure that you're not going to end up undermining conservative speech unintentionally as well. I think that would be my cautionary note. And go read some history. Obviously, you should read my book, but go and read about the history of media regulation from radio to television. Be better informed. You're not, history might not repeat itself, but it rhymes, as the WAG says. There's a lot of rhyming going on right now, and so there are scholars who can help you suss out how likely some of your proposals are to rhyme with what happened in the past, for good or for ill.
Paul, thanks so much. This has been just a delight and very informative, and I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate also those of you who joined us, and in particular, those of you who made donations to help support our work and to help to make it possible for us to do briefings like this. This video will be archived on our website, so you'll be able to share this with friends who you think should have maybe been here and should have participated in the content. And as Paul mentioned, his book is brand new. You can pre-order it on Amazon.com, and apparently you can get the Kindle version right now. So what I'd like to do is thank you all for joining us. Thank you for being in the orbit of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We appreciate that. And I wish you a good rest of your afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, guys. A lot of fun.